The store's security cameras kept picking up a customer who wasn't actually there. The night shift at Mercer's Groceries was slow, predictable, almost comforting in its monotony. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the aisles, a low, electric hum that filled the cavernous space with its own steady rhythm. Outside, the parking lot lay empty, slick with the remnants of a cold rain that had stopped hours earlier. Tommy Whitaker, the store's only employee on the graveyard shift, shuffled behind the checkout counter, thumbs tapping idly on the keyboard of the security monitor. A wall of black and white feeds filled the screen, grainy, slightly distorted images of every aisle and corner. He had learned to ignore the static, the occasional flicker of light, the vague movements that were probably just reflections or bugs crawling across the lenses. He leaned back in his chair, stretching, listening to the quiet. Only the soft squeak of his sneakers on the linoleum and the occasional rattle of a cart being moved by the air conditioning vent broke the stillness. It was routine, ordinary, until he noticed it. It was the produce aisle. Camera 4. A figure appeared between the shelves. Tall, unremarkable at first glance, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Its face was obscured, low in the frame, impossible to read in the monochrome feed. But what struck Tommy was the timing. The aisle had been empty when he glanced there just seconds ago. He double-checked the live view, physically turning his head toward the camera's line of sight. Empty. The aisle was vacant. No one. Tommy blinked. Probably a glitch, a misaligned motion sensor or a smudge on the lens. He reached for the monitor controls to zoom in, and the figure moved slightly, just enough to shift its orientation, facing another direction, pausing as if waiting. He froze. That pause had weight. It was deliberate. Probably someone who ducked behind the shelves. He muttered to himself, voice low, unconvincing. He spent the next 10 minutes watching, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But the more he observed, the more impossible it became. The figure appeared again, now in aisle 7, near the frozen foods. The camera angle captured it perfectly standing among the stacks of ice cream cartons. Tommy turned his head to check the aisle. Empty. His stomach nodded. He leaned closer to the monitor, scanning the feeds systematically. The figure kept appearing, always out of reach, always in a place where no one could physically be without entering from the opposite end of the store. Its movements were slow, almost methodical, yet eerily consistent, as if it knew the layout intimately. Tommy rubbed his eyes, flexing his fingers on the keyboard. Sweat prickled at the nape of his neck despite the chill of the night. A soft squeak behind him made him spin around. Nothing, just the empty counter, the stacks of promotional flyers, the faint hum of refrigeration units. He returned to the screens. The figure was now near the self-checkout lanes, standing motionless, watching, not moving toward the camera, just there. Tommy's heartbeat picked up. A cold pressure seemed to settle around his chest. He considered calling the manager, but it was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. No one would answer, and calling the police for an empty figure on a screen sounded insane. He checked the feeds in order again. Nothing unusual, until he glanced at the security camera covering the entrance. The doors swayed gently from the air, opening just slightly, then closing again. No one came through. No one left. Yet the figure appeared inside the store, standing by the end of aisle 2. Tommy's hand shook as he reached for the phone, then stopped. The figure tilted its head slightly, like it had noticed him. A subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It didn't wave. It didn't smile. It simply acknowledged him. And that acknowledgement, small as it was, sent a chill down his spine. He considered leaving, walking the aisles himself, but a gnawing dread rooted him to the counter. Something about the figure's movements was impossible to reconcile with the physical layout. No doors had opened. No one had entered. And yet it moved, closer each time, seemingly aware of his gaze, waiting for the right moment. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost its meaning under the harsh fluorescent lights. He caught himself staring at the feed of the storage room, a corner usually dark and forgotten. The figure materialized there too, standing just inside the doorway, partially hidden behind stacked boxes of paper towels. Tommy shook his head, blinked, switched feeds. The figure was gone. Until he glanced back. It was now in the aisle behind him. Aisle 9, perfectly captured in the grainy black and white feed. A whisper of doubt crept in. He had been alone. No one else had entered. He had locked the doors, confirmed it. The thought made him shiver. He stared at the monitor, trying to reason it out. Perhaps someone was hiding, playing a prank. Perhaps he was imagining it, letting fatigue twist reality. But even as he tried to convince himself, the figure appeared again, moving slowly through aisle 6, the slow, methodical gait impossible to mimic by anyone trying to remain unseen. It was learning the store, the shelves, the blind spots, adjusting itself. The realization made his stomach sink. This wasn't a glitch, not a human, not random. It knew the cameras. It understood them. Tommy's hands hovered over the keyboard. He had to see it closer, had to understand. He switched to the zoom function. The figure's face remained obscured, shadowed, unreadable. But something in the posture, the subtle angle of its shoulders, the tilt of its head, made him feel exposed, like it was reading him the same way he had been reading it. A soft click echoed behind him. He spun around. Empty. The lights flickered. Just for a second, but long enough for him to catch a faint outline in the peripheral vision of the counter. Just a shadow pressed against the glass doors. He froze. Back at the monitor, the figure was gone from the aisle it had been in moments ago. It now appeared by the checkout line, standing behind the other side of the conveyor belt. Tommy's fingers trembled as he scrolled through the feeds. Their entrance camera. Its shape leaned slightly into the frame, impossibly close to the glass, almost as if it had been outside all along. Impossible. No one could be there. The doors were locked. Tommy had checked. And yet, the figure turned, just barely, and faced the camera. He could swear he saw eyes. Dark, unblinking, impossibly still. It nodded. Not a wave. Not a gesture of greeting. A single, deliberate nod, as if to say, I know you're watching. The fluorescent hum of the lights flickered again. The air felt heavier, colder, charged in some way. Tommy's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to run. But the doors were behind him, unyielding, empty. The figure had never moved physically. And yet it was closer. Closer to him than the monitor, closer than the aisles, closer than the counter where he sat. It wasn't in the store. Not really. It had been here all along. Watching him, learning him, waiting. He leaned forward to zoom in one last time. The screen went black. And in the reflection on the darkened monitor, just behind him in the room, he saw it again. Standing silently where no one should be. His head tilted, eyes unblinking, still learning. And Tommy realized, with a chill that ran down his spine, that the store's security cameras had only ever been showing him what it wanted him to see. The final frame lingered, grainy and silent. And in the reflection, the figure remained. Watching. Always watching. At 2:13 a.m., every product label in the store changed to a language the clerk didn't recognize. The night had started like any other. Jake Sullivan, 23, had arrived at Cedarwood Market just after midnight. The parking lot empty except for a single, misty sedan left by a late shopper. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly, the sound pressing against the walls and ceiling like a dull insistence. The linoleum reflected the glow unevenly, mottled by faint scratches and scuffs from years of carts and spilled products. The store smelled faintly of cleaning solution and stale bread, a combination that had become normal to him. Jake moved through his routine mechanically, scanning the shelves, adjusting stray cans, straightening labels, and flipping the register tape to check for paper jams. Outside, wind rattled the aluminum siding, but inside, the air was static, calm. Hours passed in the low, steady hum of refrigeration units, punctuated by the occasional beep of the intercom or the distant groan of the overhead HVAC. At 2:13 a.m., something changed. Jake was walking down the cereal aisle, fingers brushing the cardboard edges, when he paused. Something about the labels felt off. He picked up a box of oat flakes, turning it in his hands. The bold letters spelling OAT flakes had rearranged themselves into characters that seemed like a cross between a slanted script and geometric symbols. No language he recognized, not even a partial resemblance. Must be a misprint, he muttered. He flipped another box. Same pattern. Every cereal, every granola bar, every snack transformed. He ran a finger across the packages, feeling the familiar texture of cardboard and plastic, and yet the visual information had become incomprehensible. Jake went to the cans. Beans, tomato paste, soup, same shift. Characters aligned in rigid vertical and diagonal lines, precise but meaningless to him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was fatigue. He reached the cold aisle for frozen foods, hoping irrationally that something remained normal. He stopped in the middle of the aisle. The labels on the ice cream tubs, the frozen vegetables, even the bagged fries had changed. And yet, the smell and texture were the same. He tore open a bag of peas, sniffed, crunched one between his teeth. Normal. The world tasted right but read wrong. Jake backed toward the end of the aisle, head spinning. I must be dreaming, he whispered. But when he turned, the snack aisle behind him had shifted. Not drastically, subtly. Enough that the candy section was farther than he remembered, the shelves slightly taller. He tried to remember walking past them earlier. Couldn't. Time felt stretched. He glanced at the wall clock. 2:13 a.m. The second hand was frozen or perhaps crawling, unsure. The fluorescent light flickered once. Twice. The hum grew louder. Jake reached for his phone, the only anchor. The screen glowed, showing the time and a dozen unread messages he didn't recall receiving. He tapped the camera app and aimed it at a cereal box. The characters snapped back to English on the screen briefly, before rearranging themselves again, more complex, angular, alien. He staggered back toward the front of the store, registering now with a creeping panic that the entire layout had shifted subtly. A checkout counter was a few feet farther than before. The magazine rack was rotated at an angle he didn't remember. The exit signs felt off, too low, as if the ceiling had subtly shifted. Jake tried to rationalize. Perhaps someone had hacked the store's digital labeling system. But the printed labels, cardboard, and cans, offline analog, could not be rewritten by software. And yet every single item had changed. Every aisle, every shelf. He went to the office to check the surveillance monitors, hoping to see a rational explanation. Cameras flickered, showing aisles that resembled the store but not precisely. The cereal aisle appeared at an impossible angle. The frozen foods aisle was parallel to the checkout. Each feed showed products labeled in the indecipherable script. He pressed pause. Nothing changed. He tried playback. Time skipped. The monitors no longer matched memory. Jake leaned against the counter, feeling the smooth laminate against his palms, breathing hard, mist rising with each exhale. The hum of the lights and refrigeration units felt like a pulse now, a heartbeat synchronized to the rearrangement of everything he saw. He turned toward the produce section, and the aisle seemed longer, narrower, twisting slightly like a page curling in the wind. He remembered stacking cans hours earlier. Their arrangement had been precise, ordered. Now, the cans were lined differently, numbers shifted. The labels weren't just different, they were alien but consistent. Some logic dictated them. Some unseen hand had rewritten their meaning. Jake's hands shook as he touched the shelves, tracing the letters with his fingertips. The texture was normal. Cardboard, ink, plastic, and yet a knot. The meaning had been stripped. Language itself had been warped. The labels no longer conveyed information. They demanded comprehension he couldn't provide. He staggered to the checkout, seeking the familiar register, hoping for a moment of clarity. The keys felt right under his fingers, plastic smooth, tactile. But the screen flashed an unfamiliar arrangement of symbols he couldn't parse. He pressed the total button. The numeric display obeyed, but the product names, each scanned item, remained unreadable. Jake sank into the chair behind the counter, head in his hands. The fluorescent light flickered again. The humming in the store, previously background, became almost oppressive, low and constant, vibrating through the floor beneath him, through the walls, threading up the spine. Time warped further. The hands of the wall clock jumped, then lingered. He tried to call for help. The phone dialed normally, but no dial tone. No signal. The digits in his call history were also rewritten, illegible. He closed his eyes. Maybe someone else would come in, maybe the morning shift would arrive, but the night felt eternal. When he opened his eyes, the aisles seemed longer still. The shelves curved slightly, bending out of memory's grasp. Products shifted as he moved past them, not with motion but with subtle repositioning. A box of granola seemed to anticipate his reach, edging away just beyond his fingertips. Jake realized, with a cold, creeping certainty, that he no longer understood the rules of the store. The walls, the shelves, the labels, they were being rewritten continuously. Not by him, not by technology, not by natural decay. They were being rewritten for him. The humming from the lights, the vibration through the floor, the subtle rearrangements, everything conspired to unmoor perception, not by threat, not by violence, but by the quiet insistence of a reality that no longer acknowledged him as an agent. He was reading the world incorrectly because the world itself had decided he would. He backed into the produce aisle, scanning the shelves again, looking for a single anchor, a single label, a single word, a single fruit he could name. Nothing. Each orange, each apple, each stalk of broccoli bore symbols he could not interpret. The letters danced slightly, shifting with his gaze, rewriting themselves in real time. He turned to the windows at the front. The parking lot stretched impossibly, lights dimmed and distorted. Rain traced paths down the glass, yet outside, he could not recall whether the cars had been parked before, whether they belonged. Jake sank to the floor behind the checkout counter, hands pressed to his face. The fluorescent hum pulsed now like a metronome, syncopated with the subtle vibration beneath his knees. Every shelf, every label, every object had been rewritten. The store was no longer the store he had entered, and he knew, somewhere deep and primal, that he would never leave it. At 2:14 a.m., the labels shifted again. The symbols aligned in a sequence that made sense, not to him but to something else. Something patient. Something rewriting the rules of observation, perception, and language itself. Jake pressed his hands to his eyes, tried to resist, tried to ground himself in memory. Failed. When he looked again, the shelves smiled back, inscrutable. The letters waited. And the store waited, too, rewriting him silently into its new language.